Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Phil, and I want to welcome you to this PowerPoint or keynote presentation of our class on Sacraments as Mystery. You know, we want to approach the sacraments as a divine action rather than as a human creation. And in order to do that, we have to begin not with the mechanics of the church or the rituals of the church, but we always have to look primarily and foremost to the very life of God Himself. Because all the liturgy is really, and all the church is a divinely mysterious way of reaching into the world by God the Father through His two hands that St. Irenaeus described as the Father and the Son. All liturgy, all ecclesial life is actually first and foremost the action of God upon the world, first through His incarnate Son and divine Word, and then mysteriously, but equally or more powerfully, through these mysteries that we call the sacraments, or as they are called in the Eastern Catholic tradition, simply the mysteries. And to begin to understand the mysteries, or sacraments as mysteries, or the church as a sacrament, or a mystery, the mystery of God's presence within the world, we have to realize what the nature of God is like. And on this first slide, I've put in parentheses a word that Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI both made famous by referring to the love that exists within the Trinity as a divine communio, a communication between and among three divine persons. We get our word communion or communication or community from this same root, communio, meaning a kind of togetherness. In the Christian East, in Russia, for example, or Ukraine, they call it sobornost, a sense of intimate togetherness and interconnectivity where the other person in the Trinity, for example, Father and Son, are never without each other. Through the power of the Holy Spirit from all eternity, they enjoy a certain communion together, a communio, a sobornost, a togetherness, a never withoutness. In fact, that would be a great way for you to begin to think of God as a community of persons who are never without each other. And this never withoutness is at the very heart of the nature of God. And so this concept of communion or communio, where we derive our sacrament of Holy Communion, it's really to indicate a mystery, a real nuptial mystery between the divinity of God and the humanity of the human race. What the persons of the Trinity enjoy in themselves from all eternity, and here's that beautiful icon again of Andrei Rublev, you can see that he has pictured here the intimacy of the persons of the Trinity from the beginning of all creation. But if we go back to the first slide that I had, you'll notice that the same communion exists between the Son and His Mother. As the eternal Word from the divine Trinity in heaven enters into creation, He enters into a similar kind of never withoutness, or a divine communio, first with His Mother, and then through the power of His Holy Spirit with every person in the entire world. And so now we want to see how this communion between the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit spills over into our world and embraces us in a divine embrace, just like the Son embraces His Mother in this beautiful icon. So as I say, everything begins and ends with the Trinity, and it's only when you begin with the Trinity, who is the goal, source, and archetype of all liturgy and really of all human life. You'll see that when we get to talk about the sacrament of marriage, the one flesh union of man and woman is meant to be a living icon of that same togetherness, that same communio, that same never withoutness, that same inseparability, that same unmixed connectedness that obtains among Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in the Trinity. Everything in this world, right down to the molecular level of H2O and all the other chemical compounds that we can imagine at the lowest states of nature. They exhibit a kind of Trinitarian configuration, a never-withoutness. There is no such thing as a single atom. They always come in pairs or in molecules. They are always reflecting this communion that we talk about in terms of the Trinity and the divine life. Now, in the Catholic Church and in the Catholic vision, this concept of communion penetrates every Christian doctrine that we have within our church. In fact, no Christian doctrine and the notion of Christian dogma at all is totally non-understandable until we see it in light of this mystery of communion. We start, of course, with the Trinity, which is the fontal or the primordial communion of divine persons. And coming forth from that divine communion, we have first the creation of the world and then the advent of the incarnation, where the second person of the Trinity enters into our world and enters into the same kind of communion and marriage, nuptial relationship with humanity that he has had with his Father and their Holy Spirit from all eternity. And you can see in the beautiful icon I have pictured here the baptism of Jesus in the Jordan. The impact of that icon is this. The early church fathers said that when Jesus went down into the waters of the Jordan, and the Father and the Holy Spirit appeared with him in kind of a theophanic epiphany, a theophany, a manifestation of the fullness of God. The Holy Spirit descended upon him, and the words were heard from heaven, from God the Father, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." You can see in that Trinitarian revelation that this same divine togetherness is now somehow mysteriously, mystically, and in the form of mystery being imparted to our world. And the early church fathers always said that when Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, entered the waters of the Jordan, he imbued those waters and sanctified those waters with the same power of togetherness, that same power of communion, that same form of divine love that draws everything into itself. He imparted to those waters a share in his own divinity and his own participation in the Trinitarian life of Father and Holy Spirit. And so when in that first sacrament of our church, we enter the waters of baptism, we are really entering the river of love that flows from the Trinity in the incarnation that Christ himself has somehow mysteriously imparted to the waters of baptism. I think with that little introduction, you'll begin to see why we call these tangible, material instruments of God's love, like water, oil, bread, and wine, why we begin to call them mysteries. Because it's really the power of the Trinity, the power of the Incarnation, the power of the Holy Spirit, and the presence of God the Father that has been mysteriously inserted and injected and inseminated, as it were, into these forms of God's life that we call the sacraments. And then the ecclesia, or the church, the assembly of people who are called out of the world and into communion with the Trinity through the celebration of the sacramental mysteries. This ecclesia, or this church, is exactly that. It's the communion of the divine persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, with those who have heard his call to enter into himself, his elect. The church means those who are called out of the world of sin, darkness, and death, the world of rivalry, resentment, and retaliation, the world of criticism, condemnation, and complaint. Out of that world, he calls certain people who hear his voice. If today you hear his voice, harden not your hearts. Those who have heard the call of the Lord, they leave the world of darkness and death, and they enter into the living world of the Trinitarian communion. So the church is first and foremost a communion of persons, human persons, who now want to make their home with the divine persons in a kingdom and in a peace that this world knows not of. And that's the nature of the church. And so in the end, we call all of these things, the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the Church of the Eucharist, and the Church of the Sacraments, and the Church of the Mysteries, we call it one entire mysterion, or one entire mystery. For the Church and all its sacraments are but means of Trinitarian communion of the Trinity with his people assembled around the Lamb who is slain. So in the Catholic Church then, you could say, as Pope John Paul II said in his book, Theology of the Body, the Catholic Church is actually a communion of communios, a communion of communions. The primordial communion is that of the Trinity. The next communion is the communion of creation with the Trinity, because everything that exists has a kind of inseparable relationship with God. If God forgot about us, even the worst sinner in the world, if he forgot about him for 1 second, that sinner, that mountain, that tree, that chair would evaporate. Everything that exists has a kind of communion with the Trinity. But the Incarnation brings the divine Word into communication with humanity. And for those of us who belong to the assembly of his saints, we enter into a special kind of communion that rocks and stars and mountains and hills and sinners and those who don't believe in God don't have. It's a communion that is intentionally open to receiving the divine life of God. And when that happens, a certain marriage takes place between Christ, his Father and Holy Spirit, and all of those who have received him, as Mary did when she said, "Let it be done to me according to your word." And so you can see why Mary is an image and a mother of the church here at the center of this beautiful icon with the apostles on Pentecost. Here is the feast of divinization. Here is the feast of deification. Here is where the apostles, like Mary, who was the Immaculate Conception, the apostles become the Immaculate Reconception when they open their hearts to the Holy Spirit, as Mary did at the Annunciation. And you can see the glory that descends upon them, which is an iconic image of the deifying life that comes into any person who, with Mary, opens themselves to the life of the Divine Trinity. This approach that I'm trying to promote with you, and I realize again that it'll be quite overwhelming as you listen to these initial presentations, but this is what's known as Catholic personalism, achieving nuptial intimacy with the Trinity. You see, God is not an it or a what. God is a community of whos. Nor am I a what or a thing. You and I are whos, created in the image and likeness of the three whos, the three persons, the three personalities who form the very life of God. At the risk of this sounding like Dr. Seuss theology, I will say that we are whos who are in communion with the divine whos, because to be a who is to be something much more mysteriously and incommunicable and irreplaceable and unsubstitutable than any other what in the world. Never think of yourself or another person as a what. Always think of yourself as a who, in search of the other who will make me become the best person I can possibly be. Perichoresis is a term that we use for that intertrinitarian nuptiality that exists among Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And as I said earlier, male and female image forth that Trinitarian nuptiality. The Incarnation is the nuptial union of the divine and human natures in Jesus, and the corpus mysticum, or the corporate person of Christ, is his mystical body, the Church, wherein the second person of the Trinity enters into a deep and intimate communion, a deifying communion, a life-transforming communion with all of those who belong to his mystical body, the Church. Well, I hope that introduces you a little bit to the notion of communion as the centerpiece of Catholic theology. I want to thank you for listening to this video, and I want to remind you again that the idea of communion and togetherness is the center of being a Catholic. God bless you, and praise be Jesus Christ.